The following program is a UWTV classic.
From the University of Washington in Seattle, Upon Reflection.
Hello and welcome to Upon Reflection. I'm Marcia Alvar. The fastest growing audience in the performing arts to date is that for opera, up more than 35% in this country since 1982. It's a trend Seattle Opera helped set under the imaginative and passionate leadership of its general director, Speight Jenkins. Bitten by the opera bug as a child in Texas, Jenkins was a critic and host for Metropolitan Opera broadcasts before assuming his job in Seattle in 1983. Welcome.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Why is opera having this renaissance?
I think there are two real reasons for it. One was starting in '77, the Met broadcast live from the Met began to bring opera into many more households. You know, the way I always look at television is if you go into, let's say, let me just take this in a big sense. You go into 1,000 households, 950 of them are going to cut it off or go to another channel. 25 of them might listen for 5 minutes, cut it off, and go to another channel. You know, you go down to where you get about 7 or 8 people who maybe haven't seen it before, who watch a whole act or maybe even watch a whole opera. That's more than opera houses can take in terms of space because of the power of television. See, so that was the first step. The biggest step, however, a bigger step, however, I think were titles. Because when titles started in 1983, were invented in Toronto in February of 1983, it suddenly brought opera back to its central focus because opera was always a battle between music and theater. And each time in opera's 400-year history, about halfway through the century, something happens to make people remember, oh yeah, this is drama as well as music. And when that happens, you get a big boost of interest in opera because that's what it's supposed to be.
The theatricality.
The theatricality of it. I mean, it happened in 1750 with Gluck. It happened in 1850 with Vagner. And now in our time, I think it really happened a little later than the 1850. It happened in the 1980s. But it happened so that people could see that opera stories are not silly. They are silly if you read a synopsis or even if you read a libretto because you're not hearing the music to expand them. You know, there are a whole lot of complicated answers, but that's really what it is, so that when people see the words and hear the music, it makes sense in a different way. And you also have the fact of people not being intimidated by foreign language and all of this stuff that has happened.
And being able to do the opera in the language it was written, not having to do it necessarily in English, so
that's right.
Audiences could understand it.
And then the next thing, then there is a third thing, I think, and that is that we are, and this is, I think, what's been so wonderful about young people coming to opera, is that the visual is important. I mean, the MTV generation is interested in the visual, and we do give them visual. And as some of my theater friends have pointed out, we're the only game in town that gives you more than a few people on stage at once. I mean, the theaters think they're doing a lot if they get 5 or 6 people on stage. Well, I mean, when you do a performance like a production like Werther, it's not a big scale opera with lots and lots of people, but even that at times has 15 or 20 people on stage. When we did Turandot last fall, we have 200 on stage.
Production.
You know, and I mean, and because that's what we do, you know, and so I think that kind of thing, there are a whole lot of elements that make us a little different. And I think it brought people in.
In theater in the last 10, 20 years, we've seen an expansion of the number of companies, the growth of what's called the regional theater movement. Has the same sort of parallel thing happened in opera?
Oh, definitely. I think that regional opera is much of a different level, even than when I came here in '83. I mean, I think, you know, regional opera, there are important companies in America that have, you know, statements in regional opera that are significant. I mean, we still have the 3 international companies, that is to say, New York, the Metropolitan, Chicago, and San Francisco, that theoretically present the international stars and have much bigger budgets than any of the rest of us. But we too present international stars. We too do, and I think, they present a lot. They present more opera because they all three are in huge metropolitan communities. But we, the regional level of opera in Houston or Seattle or Los Angeles is really quite on a level with most anything done.
In a talk that I saw you give, you talked about the history of the art form itself. It's around 400 years old. Began as an entertainment for the nobility, but then in the early 19th century, something happened. In Italy, Italian opera, it became this enormous phenomenon. What happened at that time in its great first popularizing?
Well, I think it came about because the composers, actually it came about because of one man more than anything else, and that was Giuseppe Verdi. Because Verdi really believed in speaking to the people. He was interested. It had started. It isn't fair. It never is one man. You'd begun as there was the post-Napoleonic era. After all, was the first great period of democratization. So what had been, there were very few nobles. There were nobles, but there were not so many. You had and after all, after 1830, the French Republic, there was a French. The Bourbons were gone. You had Louis Philippe, so you had a citizen king in France. So these things, you were bringing more people in, and so they had to play to the people. And I think that Donizetti and Bellini played to the people. They were certainly playing for general audiences, for bourgeois audiences in Italy. But Verdi really not only played, he played to everybody because he had an idea, and that was Italian unification. And from the very beginning of his work, not the first two operas, but the third opera was Nabucco. And Nabucco had in it the great plea of the Jews for freedom from the Babylonians, and that was instantly taken by the Italians to mean free from the Austrians. And so he became a national hero. Opera became a statement of Italian nationalism.
And a passion.
And so people got into it, and you had this tremendous amount of things, so it became very, very popular in that
One
sense.
of the very first stories I think I ever heard about when I was a kid about opera was a story which I don't even know is true, but I sort of hope it is. And it's about Verdi, and it has to do with the fact that the casts of his operas were often so enormous that by the time the opera would come to the stage to its premiere, half of the city would know the music, and that there were often huge sing-alongs. That the audience would actually be singing with the cast for the first time, and that he wanted to pull a trick on them and actually hid a song in one of his operas and shut the cast in the night before the premiere, and was able to perform the song without the audience serenading them along.
And I can tell you this: the precise. It may be apocryphal, but the story is very precise.
It's a great story.
The story is quite precise because the story is Rigoletto, and it's La Donna e Mobile, which is one of the most famous songs in the world. And Verdi knew that what he said was, if I rehearse this, every gondolier in Venice will be singing it before they get to the premiere. So we're not going to rehearse it at all until right beforehand. The tenor had to learn it, but we're not going to do any rehearsal. It's not going to be in the theater at all until the premiere. So that's exactly what, I don't know whether it's apocryphal either, but that's gone down through lots of Verdi biographies that he said that.
Great story, Verdi's Surprise. Yeah. One of the operas that you are most attached to in terms of your reputation is The Ring, which you called a soap opera of cosmic proportions. There seems to be a great irony about that opera, and I want you to talk about what you consider to be its great pliable nature, that it's an opera you can do a lot of stuff with, and at the same time it is the source of the most enduring stereotype about opera. Brunhilde, the hat, the horns, the shield. It seems to have this great contrast built into it in terms of its very nature and how it's perceived by the public at large.
Well, it's a funny thing to talk about because I don't honestly know why that is. Except that the only answer I can give you perhaps is that Vagner himself was such a huge figure in the 19th century. You have to understand that no artist in our century that I can think of, not even Picasso, not Balanchine, I'm trying to think of the people that really made a huge impression in art in our century. bestrode the world like the Colossus Wagner was at the time of the end of the century, because he not only was changing opera, and he did change it, but he was saying that what he was doing was changing it, and he was saying this is opera of the future, and he was saying he puffed himself up more, but he knew how to do it. He knew exactly how to do it, and after all, he's the only artist that ever had the idea that he was going to build a theater just for his art, and built it, put it on, did everything he said he was going to do, did all this, and had this, everything he did was worldwide importance, so that naturally people like the British, like Punch, the journal of comedy, so what was more fun to do than to make fun of somebody who kept saying he was so good. Now, the fact that he was big and that he was important is irrelevant to the fact that if you're saying you're big and important all the time, then then the comics are going to attack you. Well, I'm really making this up as I'm talking, because it's a question nobody's ever asked me, but I'm thinking.
It's the fat lady singing.
See, that is what, of course, there is nothing in the whole world. I had a big fight on the telephone the other day with somebody who was insisting on saying that the opera's not over until the fat lady sings, and I said, that is the expression that makes me maddest, but please, let's get off that. Let's not talk about the fat lady singing.
Sorry, I mentioned
That's
it.
the thing is that the fact is that when you're going to do comedic caricatures of Wagner, it was easy to do it because he was a little man with a big head, his nose was big, it's easy to do caricatures of Wagner. But they get tired of doing caricatures of Wagner, so what's the next thing? So they look at his operas, and you get Meistersinger, which is a 16th century Germany, and you get Tristan, which is mythic but isn't particularly any one place, and you get Parsifal that you can't figure out where it is placed, and you get Lohengrin and Tannhäuser, those are early, but you get The Ring. Now that's fun to work with, I think these people thought, because you've got these unusual old-fashioned costumes of people with women with breastplates and people with funny hats on with their heads and everything. So it became part of the comic, of the way of trying to bring Wagner down to size, the caricature. And because that caricature was so fascinating, it just lived on and lived on and lived on, and people have always been interested in it. And then it additionally, nobody changed Wagner production until 1950. Up until 1950, every Brunhilde in the world, so far as, not every, there are one or two variations, but 99% of the Brunhildes in the world wore these funny helmets and had on breastplates, and the Wotans had, Wotan looks more or less the same as he always did, with a spear and a patch. But the fact is that all the Valkyries dressed peculiarly, and Siegfried was dressed in a bear outfit, and so was Siegmund, and so these things just sort of, they were reinforced by what happened in the opera house. You add all that to the fact that The Ring has always had a certain popularity with a lot of people, and it's always been a controversial piece.
Deals with some very
because it deals
amazing
with,
and universal and weighty subjects.
Weighty issues, and I think that what was the thing about The Ring was that in the first, I hope I'm not overstating this, but I really think it's the truth. In the first 80 years of The Ring, let's say between 1876, when it was given its premiere, and 1950, which is about 75 years, the real heart of The Ring, people were scared to death to talk about. They didn't want to get into these family values issues in The Ring. They didn't want to get into incest. They tried to do everything in the world to get around it, to get around all the stuff that was going on. And it's just been since then, it's come up so much. But all these caricatures, and that's what happened.
I know we could spend the rest of the program and many more in the future talking about The Ring. But I want to show a little bit of The Ring that you introduced after you came here, and that was part of your charge as the new general director. And we're going to take a look at just a few excerpts from the new, not the newest still to come, but the one that was done by Seattle
It's history
Opera.
now.
It's
history.
now. Let's go to see it. scenes from the past Ring,
That's
the
right.
new Ring, but it's now the old Ring, done by Seattle Opera. And as we talked about earlier, those elements of theatricality very much present in those excerpts. Portions of this opera were controversial, especially in the earlier productions. My favorite critical line about this production came from New York Magazine, in which they said, "It must have taken a lot of nerve to do this version of The Ring." And in some sense, it's you were sort of saying, come take a look at us. Come see what we're doing here.
I think that's very true. You know, it actually, people always said it took so much nerve. It never took as much nerve as people said it did on my part, because I just thought this was a perfectly reasonable, logical way to do it. I was taken aback at first when there was so much booing, and thankful for so much cheering, and the letters always split half and half on The Ring. I mean, I got called everything in the world. You know, but I was talking to, actually on this subject, I was in Paris a month ago or so, and was talking to Hugues Gall, who is the director of not only the Bastille, but also the old opera house, the Garnier. He's a very important person in France now, and he's a good friend of mine, and we were having lunch, and I said, you know, we were talking about, you may remember in the news, when he took over, he fired the music director, and because he simply wasn't happy with what he was doing, he hired Jimmy Conlon as his music director, and he started off, you know, and I said to him, it's a funny thing, sometimes things happen that we don't plan, but really sort of define what we're going to be. And I said, I think with you, you didn't come in here to fire the man you fired. You didn't come in to hire, you know, but you found you couldn't work with it. You had to do it. So you got publicity in Time Magazine, and you got publicity in the New York Times and everywhere in the world over this.
And it defines him.
It defined him, and he now is running his own show. Well, with me, with The Ring, I did what I thought was right for The Ring, and I thought it was good, and I thought it was an exciting interpretation. I didn't know it would cause so much commotion, but the commotion that it caused established Seattle Opera as something in our community that was worth talking about. And that, in its sense, was why it was worth everything in the world to me. And I have never, ever, despite what anybody might think, asked for controversy. I don't ask for it. But in working in the theater, you're going to stir up controversy, I believe, if you're doing your job, because you're going to have different interpretations, and people have their own personal interpretations. They run their own headset of what they're going to do, and if it clashes, they're going to fight you. So that, in a sense, was what really happened.
And I'm sure there's already speculation in many corners about what's going to be on the stage in the year 2001 when the next Ring is performed. Any hints of what's ahead?
Except that it will be a surprise. I promise you that it will be a surprise. It's so funny.
Not spacesuits or...
No. That's silly. That was done in Gelsenkirchen.
Somebody did that already.
The spacesuits was done in not Gelsenkirchen, but a place in Germany that's slipped my mind right now. In the early 1970s, they did a whole spacesuit Ring, which was okay. I've actually seen the rings have been done in so many different ways. I saw an interesting ring in Wiesbaden once that was done all Japanese. I'm not suggesting I would do anything like this, but it was very interesting.
People will just have to hold their breath for a few years.
Oh yeah,
before that.
It'll be interesting. It'll surprise them. I know what we're going to do.
There are contemporary operas being done now at a record pace. You have people like Peter Sellers and Philip Glass who are doing opera. Writers, Joyce Carol Oates, Ishmael Reed, Doris Lessing are all excited about writing for opera. One of the phrases that's been used for some modern operas is called CNN opera, because it's about current events, the life of Harvey Milk, the death of Leon Klinghoffer, Nixon in China. Are those operas... We've been talking about one of the most enduring operas in the art form, The Ring. Are those operas going to have the same legs, the same staying power?
I think anybody who makes any cultural predictions is almost sure to be wrong. You know, I mean, because over the years that's been the case. I think it all depends on the quality of the music combined to the drama. I hate to be so simple about it, but that's all that matters. I mean, I don't think there's anything wrong with doing an opera on Nixon in China, you know, like Nixon in China or Kling or any of these things. It just depends totally on whether the music's any good and whether the music expands the text. Opera, the one thing I will say is that very few operas, there are some, because there are always exceptions to this, but there are very few operas come from like great plays. They come from weaker plays, and they have where you have to expand them with the music, because if music doesn't have any purpose, then there's no reason to do an opera. I mean, I can think of some Tennessee Williams plays in the past that have been made into operas that I would go to, and I would think that during the first act, this is really interesting, and then I would realize the music was getting in the way of a great play. If that happens, I don't think that's going to work. But I think that as long as you can expand the words, and you have music that appeals to people, you're never going to work with an opera if the music doesn't appeal to people. You know, I mean, that's all there is to it. And I mean, we've proved that there's a certain kind of opera that was done a lot in the early part of this century that the audience is never going to like. And you've got to stop that. I mean, and people are. These things that are being written now are much more romantic. And that's this opera we're going to do next year, Florencia. I got into it because I really love the music. I thought the music was beautiful. I think it's a beautiful, very romantic story, and it's lovely. It's not a CNN opera. I mean, it's a, you know, it could be said, it was set in 1910, and it's a very romantic story. But I'm not saying these operas on a given text, you know, a given thing can't work. I'm just saying everything depends on the quality of the art.
Another word that popped into my head while you were saying that was a kind of soulfulness about the music, the same sort of thing that when you were 6 or 7 years old in Texas, something touched you.
Of course, the point that what happened with opera that was so crazy, what happened with music, you know, people like to call it classical music, so I'll just use the term, was so idiotic, was that in the period, I think idiotic, in the periods in 1950s and 1960s and to a certain degree in the 1970s, composers were writing music for themselves. They didn't care whether the audience liked it or not.
In fact, they were daring audiences.
They were daring audiences to like it. And this is just absurd because audiences are going to like what they like. Period. End of discussion. They're not going to like what they don't like.
Speaking of liking or not liking, you were appointed by President Clinton to serve on the National Council on the Arts. You will serve on that body through the next century, into the next century.
Not through the next century,
Not through
I don't think.
You're really lucky and remarkable you do that. When you were talking about your trip to Paris, it popped into my head. In France, conservatives can come into power, liberals. The dollar amounts for the arts may vary, but the principle never does. There is a belief that government has a role in the arts. In this country, the arts are always seen through a prism that has morality and ideology somehow attached to it. How does that shape the work that you're doing in the council? What can you hope to achieve in that kind of setting?
Well, I think at the council, what I can hope to achieve is we are the supervisory body of the NEA, and so our job is to do 2 or 3 things. One is to influence the congressman and the 105th Congress to keep the NEA because it's important. And I believe there are a whole lot of reasons why it's important. It helps smaller groups as well as larger groups. Smaller groups, I think it helps proportionally more than the larger groups, frankly. That's very important. I think that you also want to keep the NEA, and one of the reasons that I want to keep it, and I keep saying this, and this doesn't seem to do a thing with our congressional representatives of the party that wants to, when the Republicans have generally been the ones that have been opposed to us, Democrats have generally been in favor of the National Endowment, is that I've said, you know, if we do away with the NEA, America will be the only country in the first or second world, which is to say all of Europe and many of the countries in Asia, that says the arts aren't important, that we're just, you know, that we're exactly what the Europeans love to say about us, that we're totally commercial. You know, and I profess to you that although we do know Cosimo Medici existed, we know Cosimo, not Cosimo, but Cosimo, whatever he was, he's not Cosimo, Cosimo Medici, de Medici, we know the Medicis existed. We know about them not because they were businessmen, but because they supported the arts. This is what a civilization lives by. It doesn't live by people making money. It lives by the arts. And I find it really hard to conceive of the fact that the United States, with the enormous amount of culture here, would be in a position where we simply say, we don't care, let them sink or swim. We're not going to get, there's no national interest whatsoever in it. That's one thing I really believe very strongly. Now I think, so one of our jobs in the council is to try to make people realize that the NEA has a reason for being, that it's important. The most important job, of course, is literally supervising the grants that come through. And in that, I don't know what my job, as I see it, is to look at things that make sense and approve them, and if they don't make sense, complain about them and try to get them killed.
One of the other things that has happened as the controversy over the arts has grown in recent years is that presenters like Seattle Opera are getting into the business of educating. As the schools are losing arts education, all of these things are happening. The presenters, museums, opera companies, symphonies, all seem to be much more active in terms of going out into the community. I know the opera has a program that does that, Experience Opera. Talk a bit about what Experience Opera does.
I think that, when you talk about our educational program, I always have to mention that Perry Lorenzo, when he came to the opera, when I brought him to the opera in 1992, has made a huge difference in our program, because Perry was a wonderful teacher, taught in Kennedy High School south of town here, South Seattle. And I felt he was the best teacher on opera I had ever seen in New York or Seattle, either one, and I asked him to come to me, and he did. And we have expanded tremendously in working, because Perry's theory, which has been adopted actually by quite a few opera companies in the country now, has been, it doesn't do you any good to bring children, young people, to opera performances if they're not prepared. Because then, or worse, to take an opera into a school and give them a 40-minute period of a reduced opera that's not really of a cutback opera, without preparing them, because that simply is a vacation moment. It's a moment away, but they don't know what they're seeing and they don't care.
Context.
Yeah, you got to have a context. So what you got to do is you prepare the teachers, you prepare the students, but first you prepare the teachers. It's the preparation of teachers. This has been his big program. Make the teachers know, get the teachers excited. The teachers will then work with the kids.
I've seen Perry give one of these talks, and believe me, everyone is excited by the time he's finished with it. We are literally seconds away from being out of time, and I want to be able to share with the audience. We have a little bit of an Experience Opera.
This remarkable tenor, too.
We will enjoy that, and thank you, Speight Jenkins, General Director of Seattle Opera. Come back again.
Thank you.
To see more UWTV classics, visit uwtv.org/classics.